9 signs your old life is ending, and a new one is beginning. Carl Jung observed that the human personality is not a monument finished once and set in stone, but a structure that must be quietly rebuilt more than once across a life, and that the rebuilding rarely announces itself with fanfare. It arrives first as unease, as a series of small defections from what used to work. Before we go further, let's sit with one true thing: Nietzsche, whom Jung lectured on for years and returned to again and again in his own thinking, wrote in Thus Spoke Zarathustra that one must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star. And Jung took this seriously, not as poetry but as psychology, because he had seen in his own consulting room that the collapse of an old order is not the opposite of growth, it is very often the condition for it. The ground has to loosen before anything new can put down roots in it. So if your footing feels less solid than it did a year ago, that is not proof that something has gone wrong with you. It may be the first honest sign that something in you is finally becoming true to your age and not to your habits. Here is a resolution to hold before we begin. Say it in the first person, present tense, and mean it as you say it. I release the program that carried me this far. I turn toward what my life is quietly asking of me now. I make the unconscious conscious. Say it with me. I release the program that carried me this far. I turn toward what my life is quietly asking of me now. I make the unconscious conscious. And once more, I release the program that carried me this far. I turn toward what my life is quietly asking of me now. I make the unconscious conscious. And if this kind of teaching is finding you at the right hour, I would be glad to have you subscribe so that tomorrow's reflection reaches you as well. Before the first key, if any of this is already resonating, type the words New Life in the comments, so I know these signs are landing where they need to. The first key is, the achievements that used to satisfy you no longer do. You reach the goal you spent 15 years climbing toward, and instead of the expected relief, there is a strange flatness, a sense of standing on a summit that turned out to be smaller than the map promised. Imagine a woman who spent 2 decades building a business from nothing, who finally sells it for more money than she ever imagined, who expects the morning after the sale to feel like triumph, and instead lies awake feeling nothing at all, not sadness exactly, just a hollow quiet where the excitement was supposed to be. She checks the number in her account and feels no different than she did the day before. This is not ingratitude, and it is not a flaw in her character. Jung wrote in an essay on the stages of life that we cannot live the afternoon of life according to the program of life's morning. For what was great in the morning will be little in the evening, and what in the morning was true will at evening have become a lie. This is not cynicism, it is arithmetic. The goals of the first half of life are almost always about establishment, a career, a household, a name that holds up in the world. And they are good goals, necessary ones. But they were never designed to satisfy a person for an entire lifetime. They were built to get you somewhere, not to keep you fed once you arrived. When they stop working, it does not mean you have failed at them. It means you have finished with them. The flatness is not a verdict on what you built. It is a signal that the building phase itself has quietly closed. And something in you already knows it before your calendar, your title, or your bank statement do. The second key is, the roles you play begin to feel like a coat cut for someone smaller than you have become. The title on the door, the position at the table, the identity that used to fit like a second skin, now chafes at the shoulders. You catch yourself performing competence rather than feeling it. This is the persona, the mask negotiated with the world, so that private life and public life do not collide. And for years it served you honestly. Jung wrote of it plainly, that the persona is that which in reality one is not, but which oneself as well as others think one is. And this is not an accusation. Every civilized person needs such a mask. Without one, private feeling would spill into every meeting, every transaction, every ordinary exchange at the counter of a shop. The mask is not the lie. It is the necessary translation of a private self into a public world that could not otherwise function. But Jung was careful to note that the danger is never the mask itself. The danger is forgetting that you are wearing it. Imagine a man who has spent 30 years as a respected surgeon, admired at conferences, deferred to in hallways, and imagine that this same man, at home, at the dinner table, cannot locate a single opinion or feeling that is not somehow phrased like a diagnosis. The title has not simply described him anymore. It has replaced him. When the professor comes to believe he is nothing but the textbook, when the executive cannot find a self underneath the title, the persona has stopped being a tool and has become a prison with very good lighting. And the trouble is that such a prison rarely feels like one from the inside. It feels like competence. It feels like identity. It feels, for a long while, like simply being good at one's life. So the sign to watch for is subtler than collapse. It is a certain hollow echo that follows you home after the role has been played well, a sense that the applause landed somewhere just to the left of where you actually live. If the costume that once felt like your very identity is now starting to feel like a costume, that is not betrayal of the role, and it is not ingratitude for what it gave you. Notice it plainly, without alarm. It is not proof that something has broken in you. It is only information. It means the person underneath the mask has quietly grown larger than the mask was ever cut to hold. And no coat, however well made, can be worn forever without eventually being let out to match the body it was meant to clothe. The third key is, old irritations you thought you had outgrown come back with unusual force. The sibling rivalry you thought settled, the temper you thought tamed, the envy you thought beneath you. These return not because you have regressed, but because the ground beneath your ego has shifted, and old furniture that was once wedged tightly against a wall has come loose. This belongs to what Jung called the shadow, the parts of the personality that were set aside, usually in the service of a good self-image, and left in the cellar to grow. As he put it in one of his essays, everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in a person's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. Notice the arithmetic in that line. It is not that the feeling has grown more evil with age. It is that it has grown more concentrated from decades of not being looked at. A small resentment locked in a drawer for 30 years does not stay small. It does not even stay the same shape. It thickens in the dark, the way anything left untended does. Imagine a man in his 50s, mild by every account, patient with his children, easy with his colleagues. A man who long ago decided that anger was beneath him and buried it so thoroughly that he came to believe it was simply not part of his nature. And then one ordinary evening, his adult son forgets to call as promised, and something erupts in him that startles them both. A fury out of all proportion to a missed phone call. He is not becoming a worse man in that moment. He is meeting a version of himself that was quietly filed away decades earlier and never actually resolved, only postponed. Notice too how this shows up in far smaller rooms than a family kitchen. Imagine a woman at a work dinner, watching a younger colleague receive praise for an idea, and feeling a hot flash of contempt rise in her chest that she would never say aloud and can barely admit to herself. She has spent her whole career being the generous one, the one who mentors, the one who is glad for others, and this contempt does not fit the story she tells about herself at all, so she swallows it, calls it tiredness, calls it a bad day. But it was not manufactured that evening. It was only summoned, an old buried competitiveness she disowned years ago because generosity was safer to wear in public. The second half of life has a way of presenting these old bills for payment, whether or not we feel ready to settle them. It does not consult our calendar. It simply notices when the scaffolding that kept a feeling contained has weakened, and it walks the old feeling back through the front door, uninvited, often at the exact moment we were congratulating ourselves on having become someone calmer, someone kinder, someone finished. Jung himself experienced something like this at 38. In the years right after his break with Freud, he recalled in his memoirs a period of profound disorientation, as though the solid ground he had built his identity on had given way beneath him. He did not treat this as catastrophe to be managed away. He treated it as material. He sat with the images that rose up in him and let them speak, and what came out of that descent became some of his most important work. Notice that he did not try to argue the feelings back down into the cellar, and he did not pretend they belonged to someone else. He gave them an audience. This is the harder discipline, because the instinct when an old ugliness resurfaces is to disown it a second time, to say that was not really me, that was stress, that was a bad night. But the shadow does not respond to that kind of dismissal. It only waits again, longer this time. So when old material rises now, uninvited and inconvenient, arriving in a tone that feels almost too large for the small event that triggered it, the question worth asking is not how do I get rid of this? It is what does this want me to see that I have been too disciplined, for too long, to look at directly, and what would it cost me now, at this stage of my life, to finally let it be seen, rather than filed away again. The fourth key is, a restlessness sets in that outward success cannot quiet. You may have every external marker of a life well built, and still there is a low current of dissatisfaction underneath it, like a room that is warm enough but somehow still feels drafty. This is one of the clearest signals that the first half of life's program has reached the end of its usefulness. Jung described individuation as a coming to selfhood, a process by which a person becomes what he called an individual, a being psychologically indivisible, a separate unity or whole, and he noted that this process usually does not begin until the outer scaffolding is fully built. You cannot outgrow a house you never finished building. That is why this restlessness so often visits people who by every external measure have arrived. The arrival is precisely what makes room for the next question. Quieter, and much harder to answer with a promotion, the question of what all this building was actually for. Imagine, as Jung once described in his writing on the stages of life, a successful businessman who retires at the peak of his career only to fall into a depression that mystifies everyone who knew him. From the outside he had everything. From the inside the entire architecture of meaning that organized his days for 30 years simply stopped functioning overnight, because it was built for climbing, not for living once you have arrived. Notice this carefully. It is not that he regrets what he built. The trophies still sit catching the light. The trouble is that the machinery converting effort into satisfaction has quietly gone still, and no new achievement seems able to restart it. Our culture has almost no vocabulary for this. We assume that if the drafty feeling arrives after success, rather than failure, something must be wrong with the person feeling it, ungrateful, unable to enjoy what they earned. But Jung's reading runs the opposite way. The restlessness is not a defect, it is a correct diagnosis. The psyche reporting, accurately, that the goals of establishment have finished their job. Imagine someone counting the same money twice, hoping the second count will feel different. It never does, because the dissatisfaction was never about the quantity. Picture the quieter version too. Not a businessman, but someone who kept every promise made to themselves at 25. Standing in the kitchen some ordinary Tuesday evening, dishes done, everything in its place, feeling an ache with no locatable cause. That ache is not ingratitude. It is the sound of a finished program still running out of habit. An engine idling long after the car has already arrived. The honest response is not a bigger engine. It is to ask, gently, what this vehicle is actually for now, and to let the question sit unanswered for a while, rather than drowning it in the next available achievement. The fifth key is, certain relationships that once felt essential begin to feel like costumes worn past their fitting. This is one of the more painful signs, because it can look, from the outside, like coldness or ingratitude. But it is rarely either of those things. Imagine two colleagues who spent a decade building a company together, sharing every crisis, finishing each other's sentences in meetings, calling each other first with both the good news and the bad, and then one of them sells his share and steps away, not out of betrayal, but because something in him has simply finished with that chapter. The friendship does not collapse dramatically. It just goes quiet. The calls space out. The old jokes stop landing the way they used to, and both men are left slightly bewildered, wondering what happened to something that felt so solid for so long. What happened is nothing sinister. The relationship was built around a shared role, a common project, a common stage of life. And when the underlying person shifts, a relationship built purely on function has nothing left to hold on to. This is delicate ground, and it deserves patience rather than sudden dramatic decisions. Because the temptation in this stage is to interpret every cooling friendship or quieted marriage as proof that something was always false, when very often what was true was simply partial, built to carry you through one season, and never meant to carry the whole of a life. Jung's own thinking on relationship suggests a useful distinction here. Some bonds are built on shared function alone, the parents raising children side by side, the co-workers chasing the same deadline, the friends bound by proximity or convenience. And these bonds, when the function ends, often end quietly with it. But other bonds are built on something closer to a genuine seeing of the other person, a recognition that survives the change of role, because it was never really about the role in the first place. Those bonds tend not just to survive this transition, but to deepen through it, taking on a new and often more honest shape once the old scaffolding falls away. So if a friendship or a marriage or a working partnership feels thinner than it once did, the question worth sitting with quietly is not was this always a lie, but what exactly was this relationship actually holding? Was it holding two people who genuinely saw each other, or was it holding two roles standing conveniently side by side? If it was the latter, and it falls away now, that is not necessarily a tragedy to be mourned without end. It may simply be the old life completing itself, releasing what it no longer needs to carry, so that whatever is real underneath can either be found again in a new form or can be allowed, honestly and without bitterness, to rest. The sixth key is, you find yourself pulled, almost against your own better judgment, toward things you once dismissed as impractical, a hunger for painting, for solitude, for music, for something you would once have called indulgent or unserious. This pull is not a character flaw, and it is not a midlife whim to be laughed off. It is the unlived life beginning to knock. Jung taught that whatever is set aside in the service of a practical, adapted first half of life does not simply vanish. It waits, and it tends to return with considerable insistence once the original project it was sacrificed for has been completed. Think of it less like something lost and more like something owed, a debt the personality quietly carried forward, gathering interest in the dark. Imagine a woman who at 22 wanted, more than anything, to study languages and travel, but a family needed steadying and a household needed running, so she set that hunger down gently, telling herself it was only for a season. She became extraordinarily capable at the practical machinery of life, and she was, by every outward measure, a success at it. And then decades later, with the household finally quiet, she finds herself standing in a bookstore, unable to walk past the language section, buying a beginner's grammar book she has no obvious use for, feeling almost embarrassed by how badly she wants it. That is not a woman losing her mind. That is the 22-year-old finally being let back into the room, the accountant who suddenly wants to write, the surgeon who suddenly wants silence and long walks, the parent whose children are grown and who finds an old, buried curiosity about painting rising up with startling force. These are not distractions from a well-ordered life. They are messages from the part of the personality that was asked to wait its turn. And its turn has now come. Notice too how this pull rarely arrives as a grand plan. It arrives as a small persistent itch, an hour spent watching tutorials you will not admit to anyone you are watching, a longing that seems disproportionate to the small thing that triggers it. That disproportion is precisely the signature of something unconscious. Ordinary curiosity is quiet. This pull is not quiet. It has weight, and the temptation is always to reason it away, to call it impractical, to call it too late, to say a person my age does not start such things. But Jung would ask you to notice that the timing is not an accident of vanity. It is the psyche's own arithmetic. The thing waited until you had built enough stability to actually hold it. It is worth saying plainly here that the popular idea that life simply begins at 40, a phrase that actually comes from a 1932 book by Walter Pitkin, and the modern idea of a scheduled midlife crisis, a term coined by the psychologist Elliot Jaques in 1965, are not what Jung was describing. Jung was not offering a calendar date. He was describing an inner readiness that can arrive earlier or later, depending entirely on how honestly a person lived their first half. Some people meet this doorway at 30, some at 60. The date on the calendar is far less important than the noticing, and the noticing begins simply by asking yourself without embarrassment what it is you keep almost doing, keep almost buying, keep almost signing up for, and then wondering, quietly, what that almost has been trying to tell you all along. The seventh key is, your dreams begin to change in tone and cast of characters. Figures you have never met before start appearing. Old familiar dream settings give way to unfamiliar landscapes, animals, or strangers, or symbolic scenes that feel weighted with an importance you cannot quite name upon waking. Jung's method with dreams, though it belongs properly to its own study, offers one useful compass point here. He taught that dreams compensate the conscious attitude. They supply what the waking mind has been neglecting, so a shift in the pattern of your dreams over months, not one dream but a series, is often the unconscious registering a shift in the whole psychic weather before the conscious mind has caught up. Imagine a woman who for 20 years dreamed mostly of exams she was late for, of bosses disappointed in her, of houses with rooms she could never quite finish cleaning. Dreams, in other words, that mirrored the pressure and the striving of her daytime life with almost comic precision. And then, without any outer event to explain it, the dreams begin to change. An old woman she has never met starts appearing at the edge of her dreams, saying little, simply present. Or she dreams of a house she has never lived in, that nonetheless feels more like home than any house she has actually owned. She wakes from these newer dreams not anxious, but strangely quieted, as though something in her had been visited, rather than chased. This is the kind of shift worth paying attention to, not because any single image carries a fixed meaning, waiting to be decoded like a cipher. Jung was firm that there is no dictionary for this. The same image means something different in every dreamer's life, but because the direction of an entire series can be read the way you read weather moving across a valley, you do not need to catch every drop of rain to know a storm is arriving. The practice here does not require any special talent for symbolism. It requires only a plain habit. Keep a few lines each morning before the day's noise erases the night's material. Not an essay, just enough to hold the bones of the dream, the setting, the figures, the feeling you woke with, and then, after some weeks, read the pages back in a single sitting, not hunting for hidden codes but simply asking, where does this series seem to be leaning? Toward endings or beginnings, toward figures who feel like intruders, or figures who feel like guides, toward the same anxious rooms of the old life, or toward landscapes you have never consciously imagined. That lean, more than any single image, is the message, and it can tell you something true about where you actually stand in your own life, regardless of what your calendar, your job title, or your own stubborn insistence that nothing has changed might otherwise try to tell you. The eighth key is, you find yourself grieving and curious at the same time, mourning the closing of a chapter while, almost in the same breath, feeling a strange and unfamiliar interest in what has not yet happened. This double feeling confuses people because our culture trains us to expect grief and hope to arrive one after the other. First the sadness, then eventually the moving on, a clean handoff. Tears finished before curiosity is permitted to enter the room. But Jung's picture of the second half of life is not sequential in that tidy way. It is simultaneous. The morning and the afternoon overlap for a time, and in that overlap a person can genuinely feel both the loss of what the first half built and a real, if faint, curiosity about what the second half is asking for. Imagine a woman who has spent 20 years raising children, and the youngest finally leaves for their own life. She stands in the quiet kitchen, and something in her aches, genuinely aches, for the noise and need that filled her days, and she would tell you plainly that she misses it, and yet in that very same hour, she notices herself glancing at a stack of books she never had time for, or wondering what her own voice sounds like when it is not answering someone else's question. She does not experience this as betrayal of her grief. She experiences it as two true things happening in the same body at once, and if she is honest with herself, she may even feel guilty about the curiosity, as though wanting something new proves the old life did not matter. But it proves nothing of the kind. It only proves that a life is still alive, still capable of holding more than one feeling, without needing to resolve them into a single tidy emotion. This is not confusion, it is the natural texture of a genuine transition, and it deserves to be allowed, rather than resolved too quickly in either direction. If you rush to comfort the grief, you may miss the curiosity trying to speak underneath it, silencing something quietly trying to be born, because it seems disrespectful to what is ending. And if you rush toward the curiosity, chasing the new thing, to avoid sitting with the loss, you may bypass grief that needs its proper hearing first, and grief unheard has a way of returning later, heavier, at a worse hour, dressed as something else entirely. So the practice here, if it can be called that, is simply to let both be true on the same afternoon, to grieve what is ending, without pretending it does not matter, to name it out loud if you need to let the sadness take the space it actually requires, and at the same time to notice what is beginning, without pretending you already understand it, without forcing it into a plan or a 5-year vision, just noticing it, the way you would notice weather changing, a different quality of light in the room. Both are honest, and honesty, more than any 5-step plan, is what this stage of life actually asks of a person, not resolution, not a tidy conclusion, but the willingness to stand in the doorway, with one hand still touching what is behind you, and the other reaching, uncertainly, toward what has not yet taken shape. The 9th key is, underneath all the others, a quiet call begins to make itself heard, not loud, more like a persistent undertone beneath the noise of ordinary days, a sense that your life is asking to become distinctly your own, rather than a well-executed copy of what was expected of you. Jung called this whole movement individuation, the process of coming to selfhood, of becoming an individual, a psychologically indivisible whole, and this is never handed to a person, it has to be lived into, often through exactly the unease we have been naming across these 9 signs. All of it points toward one quiet demand: become who you actually are, rather than who you were trained to be. Imagine a man known for 30 years, reliably, as the dependable one, never raising his voice, never missing a deadline. This was a genuine achievement, built plank by plank, and it served him well, the marriage, the position, the respect of his neighbors. But past 50, he begins to notice a small flinch whenever someone praises his reliability, as though the compliment describes a coat rather than a man. He cannot explain it. He only knows that being called dependable no longer feels like being seen, it feels like being filed. That flinch is the 9th key already working in him, not asking him to become undependable, but asking whether dependable was ever the whole truth, or only the safest part of it to show. This call rarely arrives as clear instruction. It arrives as a flinch, a flatness, a question asked on an ordinary Tuesday, and because it is quiet, it is easy to mistake for a mood to be managed, rather than a summons to be answered. People often medicate it, with more achievement, more busyness, hoping activity will drown the voice underneath. But Jung observed that this voice does not vanish when outrun. It grows more insistent, until it finds some way to be heard, gently through a dream or a restlessness, or less gently, through a collapse, that forces the question anyway. A practical way to meet this without waiting for collapse is a morning program audit. Take a plain sheet of paper and write the beliefs about success, worth, and identity you inherited or built in the first half of life. Not to condemn them, they likely served you honestly, but to ask of each one, quietly, is this still mine, or was it only handed to me and never set down? Some will still hold their weight, keep those, others will not. And those are simply the morning's program correctly retired at the arrival of afternoon. This is not abandonment of the life you built, it is the most respectful way to honor it, by letting it finish, rather than forcing it to run past its natural close. The dependable man, if he does this honestly, may find dependability worth keeping, but never meant to be the whole shape of him, only one room in a much larger house, still waiting to be explored. Here is the whole picture. An old life does not usually end with a single dramatic door slamming shut. It ends the way Jung actually described it, gradually, through a series of small defections, an ambition that stops satisfying, a role that stops fitting, a shadow that insists on being seen, a restlessness no achievement can quiet, relationships that shift shape, an unlived hunger that finally speaks up, dreams that change their cast, a grief and a curiosity arriving together, and beneath all of it, a quiet, persistent call toward becoming distinctly your own. None of these signs are malfunctions. They are the unconscious, doing exactly what it does when a person is ready for the next stage of their own becoming. The discomfort is not the enemy of the new life. It is the doorway into it. Say it once more with me. I release the program that carried me this far. I turn toward what my life is quietly asking of me now. I make the unconscious conscious. And so the question worth carrying with you past this fire is not whether your old life is ending. The signs already answer that plainly enough. The real question, the one only you can sit with, is what is the new one asking you to become?